Hey, just giving you guys a quick heads up that there will be some very minor spoilers in this review. If you don't want to know what some bosses look like, and if you don't want to know what some minor plot elements are, then you might want to turn the review off, because those will be spoiled in the review. But without further ado, let's get into it.
Activating short-range attack gear.
Video games are a very unique form of entertainment in that interaction is the entire crux of this medium. No other form of entertainment allows you to have such an impact on what you are engaging with. Gameplay is, unsurprisingly, the foundation of what makes a video game a video game. So when a game overlooks such a critical feature, everything else suffers for it. NieR Automata is one of those games. To put it bluntly, NieR Automata should have been a movie or a TV series. There was no reason for it to be a game if Platinum was going to execute on that front as poorly as they did. Obviously, this leads me into my biggest complaint with the game, which was the gameplay. Platinum Games is a company that knows how to make a good video game, so I'm completely baffled as to why this game was so poorly designed. Not a single combat encounter was engaging, the combat was simple and gave me no reason to get any better at it, the difficulties were all over the place, and every single boss was forgettable at best. The biggest sin of the issues I mentioned above was easily the lack of engaging combat encounters. Take a look at any other good character action game and you'll see why NieR is so severely lacking in this regard. In any other character action game, you have a simple hierarchy of enemies with the lowest enemy being the simplest to handle and the highest enemy being the most difficult. Usually these enemies are all fitted with some sort of gimmick, so when you begin to mix and match all different sorts of enemies, you get really interesting and unique encounters where you have to assess the situation and react accordingly. In NieR, you have a severe lack of unique enemies, so every fight ends up playing out the same way. You either have a bunch of melee enemies that will occasionally throw out either a single attack or a flurry of attacks, and then you have the ranged enemies which will throw bullets at you from across the room. There are one or two enemies that mix these two styles together, but even then they aren't interesting as they just swap between those two modes of attack instead of blending them together in a compelling way. These poor combat encounters led to the entire game feeling like a chore, as the 400th time of fighting the same group of enemies the same way will start to weigh on you. Speaking of samey combat encounters, let's talk about the actual combat and why it was lackluster as well. NieR is one of the more simplistic Platinum games I have played. You can go through the whole game without really getting into the game's mechanics, and, to me, that is a sign of poor design. You can get through the entirety of this game without ever using your strong attack, or without ever weapon switching mid-combo, or even without taunting, parrying, or using a charge attack. Other character action games will either force you to learn a new mechanic to progress through the game, such as Metal Gear Rising, or the difficulty will ramp up in such a way that you're required to improve in order to handle yourself in these harder fights. NieR does neither of these, as the first group of enemies you fight will be no different from the last group. The difficulty also had an effect on how unenjoyable the combat was. NieR suffers from the classic issue of having a normal mode that's too easy and a hard mode that's too hard. So, you're either stuck going through the game without a single issue, or you're struggling to get past even the simplest encounter. I tried numerous times throughout my playthrough to try and bump the difficulty up to hard in hopes of being able to extract some more enjoyment out of this game's combat system. Instead, what I got were enemies that hit 3 times harder. And that's it. Couple this absurd damage output with the archaic save system this game used, and you've got an incredibly frustrating experience on your hands. The way this game was structured also magnified the issues that I had with the gameplay. NieR Automata likes to reuse assets. A lot. Throughout a standard playthrough, you will go through each area at least 3 times. 2 of those times are spent doing almost the exact same thing, with very little extra added on. This game had a tendency to drag in the way it was designed, and this only helped to amplify the issues I had with the combat. Finally, what really disappointed me with this game was the lack of interesting bosses. On both the design front and the gameplay front, bosses in this game were severely lacking. Design-wise, every single boss was either a big circle with some slight variations, or a humanoid. As for the actual fights themselves, they're no better or worse than the usual fights. Completely forgettable movesets coupled with no interesting hook. You just spam X on them and dodge their attacks, then move on with your life. There were some interesting fights, and by some I mean 2, but the overall lack of compelling boss fights was another issue that I found with this game. The gameplay as a whole wasn't unbearably awful, but it was almost completely overlooked. I'm not sure what happened in development that led to NieR having such poor gameplay, but regardless, the game shipped in an especially disappointing state. Then there's also the issue of the genre switching that this game tries to do. Now, genre switching isn't an inherently bad thing, and can lead to some really cool moments in a game. However, in NieR, all of these attempts at genre switching are half-baked at best. All of the shoot-em-up sections felt ridiculously basic and offered nothing interesting for the player to engage with. There was no challenge in these sections, and the progression was severely lacking. Your first shmup section will be the exact same as your last. The way this game tried to intermingle 2 styles was commendable, but ultimately the execution just fell flat. Had this been all the game had to offer, then I would have trouble recommending this to anyone. But there is a gem hiding at the center of this game. NieR Automata is an amazingly well-written game. From the characters, to the world, to the plot, this game was simply firing on all cylinders. All throughout the game I was eager to learn more about what was going on, or to find out a little bit more about the characters I was interacting with. Everything in this world felt logical and justified, and that's saying a lot considering how you play as an anime robot waifu who swings around a massive sword. But it wasn't just the quality of the writing. The style was something that took me by surprise as well. After playing through all of NieR, I feel as if I could pick out something Yoko Taro wrote out of a lineup. The way he was able to get across such a unique sense of style in his writing was something that I personally fell in love with. Really though, what capped it all off was the depth that this game's writing offered. NieR Automata does a remarkable job of leading you down a disturbingly dark and dismal path, while having you question everything along the way. The way this game ends will leave you with such a bizarre sense of melancholy that you'll need a little while to unpack what just happened. Not only that, but NieR explores some exceptionally unique ideas that games usually don't touch on. I can't really expand this without getting too far into spoilers, but some of these topics include permanence of death, motivation, purpose, what it means to be human. All of these things are tackled in one way or another in this game, and they're all handled in a way that felt natural and mature. In all honesty, the writing is the only thing that kept me interested in this game. Everything was structured in a way that I found to be incredibly intriguing, and had it not been for the stellar writing this game presented me with, I wouldn't have even finished this game. That's really it though. NieR Automata didn't bring enough to the table to justify its lazy gameplay. It's extremely disappointing that such a large swath of this game is as underwhelming as it is. Had Platinum spent a little more time on refining the gameplay of NieR, then we would potentially be looking at one of the best character action games of all time. Instead, what we got was a half-baked mess, filled with completely uninteresting action sequences, forgettable bosses, a difficulty that jumps all over the place, and combat that puts the player to sleep. Overall, NieR Automata is a 3 out of 5. The outright boring combat was such an incredible letdown. Not to mention all of the poorly executed shooter sequences. It's just so exceptionally disappointing that Platinum put out such a lackluster game. The writing was NieR's only saving grace, because had it not been for the stellar story this game dished out, I would have dropped this game after my first ending. But really, this game could have been so much more.